Christmas horror stories. Horror shorts party. The snow fell gently outside the windows, blanketing the world in a soft, serene white. Inside, the crackling sound of a fire in the hearth filled the otherwise quiet air, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was Christmas Eve, a time when families came together, shared stories, and celebrated the joys of the holiday season. But not all families are the same, and not all Christmases are merry. For Emily, tonight wasn't about laughter or cheer. It was about keeping up appearances. She stood in the living room, adjusting the garland on the fireplace, trying to make everything look perfect for her guests. The smell of freshly baked gingerbread filled the air, and the soft glow of Christmas lights twinkled across the room. But something felt wrong. There was a tension in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Something about this holiday just didn't sit right. Her husband, Mark, had been distant lately. His eyes, once full of warmth and love, were now cold and vacant. The spark that had once lit their home seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Emily had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just the stress of the season. After all, who could blame him? The holiday season was always chaotic, and with the recent move to a new house, it had been hard to keep up with everything. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something dark lurking beneath the surface. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. She jumped, her heart racing for a moment before she sighed in relief. Guests. They were late, but at least that meant the party was finally starting. She opened the door with a forced smile, welcoming her friends and family into the warm, festively decorated living room. But as they entered, something strange happened. The temperature seemed to drop. A cold breeze swept through the room, and the flickering lights dimmed for a brief moment. No one else seemed to notice, but Emily's skin prickled with unease. As the night went on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Laughter and conversation filled the air, but it all felt forced, as though everyone was pretending to enjoy themselves. Even the holiday music playing softly in the background seemed eerie, the joyful notes twisted and distorted in Emily's ears. She kept glancing at Mark, who was standing near the fireplace, his face expressionless, as though he were a mere spectator to the chaos around him. The doorbell rang again, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been expecting anyone else. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. Just the faint scent of pine and something else, something she couldn't place. She stepped outside, her breath misting in the frigid air, and looked around. The street was empty, the snow falling in thick, soft flakes, but something felt off. She could have sworn she saw movement in the shadows, but when she turned, no one was there. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but no one was there. Just the wind and the snow. But in the distance, she noticed something else, someone standing in the yard, just outside the circle of light from the porch. It was a figure, tall and cloaked in black. The hood of the cloak hid its face, but Emily could feel its gaze on her, burning through the darkness. Shaken, she slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. The party continued, but the strange figure lingered in her mind. Who was it? And why were they standing out there, watching? Later in the evening, as the party grew louder, Emily tried to push the unsettling encounter from her mind. She smiled, played the part of the perfect hostess, and poured another drink for her guests. But something wasn't right. Mark had disappeared. She hadn't seen him for a while, and when she tried to find him, he wasn't anywhere in the house. Panic slowly crept in as she searched room by room, calling his name, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. Emily froze. This time, she didn't want to answer it, didn't want to know who was out there, but something forced her to move. She walked slowly to the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. She opened it, and this time, there was no one outside. Instead, there was a single gift, wrapped in dark crimson paper, the edges frayed and worn as if it had been there for years. Her heart pounded as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. She didn't recognize the handwriting on the tag, but it was addressed to her. For Emily, from an old friend. The note sent a chill down her spine, but she opened the gift anyway. Inside was an old, tarnished key, its shape unfamiliar but unmistakable in its ominous simplicity. Confused and frightened, Emily held the key in her palm. What was it for? What was going on? She turned it over, and etched into the metal were strange symbols, symbols she couldn't read but felt somehow familiar, as if they had been part of her life long ago. The key felt heavy in her hand, like a burden she wasn't ready to bear. A loud crash broke the silence, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps running through the house. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the noise. It was coming from upstairs. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and began to climb the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The house felt colder with each passing second, the walls closing in on her as she ascended to the second floor. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The hallway was dark, the faint light from the Christmas tree below casting long shadows across the walls. The footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. Emily's pulse quickened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones, like an ancient evil that had been waiting for this moment to strike. She moved forward, each step deliberate and careful. She reached the first door on her left, her hand shaking as she pushed it open. The room was empty, but the air was thick with a strange, oppressive presence. It felt like someone, was watching her. A low, guttural sound echoed from down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Emily's heart raced as she turned to face the darkness. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was Mark. Or at least, it looked like him. But there was something terribly wrong. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't belong on a human face. Emily, the figure rasped, its voice hoarse and unnatural. Come closer. It's time. Fear gripped Emily's chest, but she couldn't move. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Slowly, the figure reached up and removed its hood, revealing the face of her husband. But his skin was pale, deathly so, and his eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Mark? Emily whispered, her voice barely a sound. The figure chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. Not Mark. Not anymore. You shouldn't have come here, Emily. You shouldn't have let it in. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Emily stumbled back, but before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the twisted version of her husband. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. "Let me out," she screamed, banging on the door, but the room grew colder with each passing second. The figure's grin widened, revealing sharp, yellow teeth that seemed too large for its face. "You're not going anywhere," the figure said in a voice that was no longer human. "Not until the party is over." The air grew thick with an unnatural chill as the figure lunged at her, its hands outstretched. And then, everything went black. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythm that seemed too loud, too frantic. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room around her felt as though it were closing in, the walls pressing inward with each passing second. The figure, her husband, no, not Mark, was moving closer, its grotesque grin stretching wider as it took another step toward her. The air around them was thick with something cold, something unnatural. She felt the weight of it, suffocating her, as if the very atmosphere had turned against her. The figure's eyes glowed with an eerie light, sickly yellow, like the eyes of a predator, watching its prey. Emily tried to scream, but her throat felt dry, as though something had clamped down on it, preventing any sound from escaping. Her fingers gripped the edge of the door, her nails digging into the wood, but it didn't budge. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. No escape. Her only choice was to face the horror in front of her. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice shaking, barely audible, as she struggled to keep her composure. The figure stopped in its tracks, its grin widening even further, impossibly wide. It tilted its head, and for a moment, Emily thought it might actually speak her name, asterisk, but it didn't star. Instead, it let out a low, guttural chuckle, one that sent chills skittering down her spine. "Asterisk, not asterisk, Mark," it rasped, the voice distorted and wrong, like it was being filtered through something unnatural. "Asterisk, not anymore, asterisk." Her hands trembled as she backed away, each step slow and careful, though the feeling of being watched never left her. The darkness of the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing longer, consuming the light that came from the room behind her. Emily felt a cold hand grip her wrist, pulling her back toward the door. But when she spun around, no one was there. The air felt colder still, like frost was creeping into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. She looked back toward the figure, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It hadn't moved. It was still standing in the same spot, its eyes fixed on her, never blinking. Its grin had not faltered, not even for a second. It was as though it was enjoying her terror, savoring the moment. But what did it want? Why was it here? Why did it look like Mark? Emily's thoughts were clouded, her vision blurry with fear. She tried to push herself to think, to find some way out of this nightmare. She looked down at her hand, still clutching the strange key that had appeared on her doorstep earlier. It felt heavy, as though it was made of something far more sinister than metal. Could it be the key to escape? Could it open a door that would lead her away from this hellish nightmare? She didn't know. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered. For a brief moment, everything went pitch black. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. Then, with a sudden burst of light, she saw it, the figure had moved. But it wasn't where it had been a second ago. Now, it was standing right in front of her. She froze, the blood in her veins turning to ice. It reached out, its long fingers like twisted branches, grasping at her arm with unnatural strength. Emily gasped, but no sound came out. She tried to pull away, but the grip on her wrist was unrelenting. It was pulling her closer, inch by inch, and with each movement, Emily could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the world itself were being swallowed by an icy abyss. The walls seemed to close in, and the ceiling felt lower, the space suffocating. "Please, stop," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. The figure tilted its head once more, its eyes never leaving hers. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed too large for its mouth, like they didn't belong there. The grin stretched impossibly wide, far wider than should have been humanly possible, until it filled the entire space in front of her. And then, in a voice that was so far removed from Mark's, it spoke. "It's already too late." Emily's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her mind raced, but nothing seemed to make sense. The figure laughed, a low, raspy sound that echoed off the walls, reverberating in her skull. The sound was maddening, like it was inside her head, crawling under her skin. Without warning, it released her wrist. Emily stumbled backward, her body colliding with the wall behind her. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The key was still clutched tightly in her hand. The door behind her was closed, locked, and the hallway was pitch black once more. The figure, or whatever it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She blinked, trying to make sense of the situation. The sound of distant music reached her ears, faint and distorted, as though coming from far away. She turned toward the sound, hoping it was a sign of something familiar, something safe. The Christmas carols had stopped long ago, but now they had started again, a warped, dissonant version of the cheerful tunes that once filled the house. The music seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the living room. But there was something wrong with it. The once merry notes were now twisted, distorted, like a lullaby sung by something malevolent. The melody echoed down the hallway, its sound crawling into her bones, gnawing at her sanity. It was like the music was calling to her, pulling her in, urging her to come closer. The hallway stretched out before her, darker than before, the shadows deeper. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The key felt warm in her hand now, almost alive, pulsing with a strange energy. She walked slowly, every step echoing in the silent house, the floorboards creaking under her weight. As she moved, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the house was alive, its walls breathing, its floors sighing with every step. Emily reached the top of the stairs. The sound of the warped music grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. The living room below was bathed in an eerie glow, the Christmas tree lights flickering in a strange, unnatural pattern. But as she descended, something caught her eye, a shadow darting across the walls of the hallway. She froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her mind screaming for her to turn around and run. But her feet didn't move. They couldn't. The figure. It was standing at the bottom of the stairs, its back turned to her, its cloak flowing like smoke. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure turned slowly, its face now visible. It was Mark, or at least, it looked like Mark. But it wasn't. The man, if that's what it was, grinned at her, a sickly, twisted smile that made her stomach churn. The room behind him was pitch black now, the festive decorations gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. It was as though the house itself had been drained of all life, and in its place, something darker had taken hold. "Welcome to the party, Emily," the figure said, its voice chilling, as though it came from the depths of the earth. "It's time to join us." Before Emily could react, the lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed her whole, and she was plunged into a world of shadow and terror. The sounds of footsteps echoed from every direction, and the music, the distorted Christmas carols, continued to play, louder now, as though mocking her. The house was alive with an evil presence, one that could not be ignored, no matter how hard she tried. She had been pulled into something much darker than a simple Christmas horror. The key in her hand burned against her skin, and the figure, her husband, or what had once been him, moved closer. Its grin never faltered. Emily's breath hitched. There was no way out. There was only the party. The dark, twisted party that had waited for her, for this very moment. And as she stared into the abyss of the room, she understood. The terror had just begun. The darkness swallowed her whole, consuming every shred of sanity she had left. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the distorted Christmas music still blaring through the house. The cold that gripped her skin felt like it was reaching into her bones, sucking the warmth from her very soul. She could hear nothing but the music, that twisted, dissonant melody that had once been a symbol of comfort, now warped and mangled, as if the house itself had become part of the nightmare. Her eyes darted around the void, trying to adjust to the darkness. She could no longer see Mark, or whatever that thing was, standing at the foot of the stairs. It was as if the house itself had swallowed him whole, leaving only a lingering presence that suffocated her with its malevolent weight. She stumbled back, her legs weak, her body trembling with fear. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the air in front of her, but it wasn't the cold that made her feel like she was suffocating. It was the darkness, the feeling that she was being watched by something far worse than her own fears, something ancient and hungry. The key burned hot in her hand, its surface slick with sweat, but every time she looked at it, it seemed to grow colder, as if the evil it contained was slowly creeping into her skin. Her mind screamed for answers, for escape, but the only thing she could focus on was the oppressive silence that followed the music series song. What was happening, she didn't know. She couldn't understand. The house, once full of festive cheer, now felt like a prison, its walls alive, watching, breathing. The sounds of the house creaking, the wind howling outside, were all distant echoes now, swallowed by the heaviness of the night. Her feet moved on their own accord, carrying her forward, as if her body knew that there was no turning back. The living room was just ahead. She could hear the soft swish of a cloak, the rustling of fabric against the air, as though the figure was still waiting for her. Waiting for her to accept it. The thought made her stomach turn, and for a moment, she hesitated. She wanted to turn back, to run, to escape this nightmare, but her legs wouldn't obey. She could feel it in her gut, the cold certainty that whatever was waiting for her in that room wasn't going to let her leave. She stepped forward, one foot, then the other, each movement slow, deliberate. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The air seemed to press in on her from all sides. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. She was lost in the darkness, and every step she took only seemed to pull her deeper into whatever this thing was. The living room door loomed ahead, like the mouth of some monstrous beast, waiting to swallow her whole. She reached for the handle, her hand shaking uncontrollably as she touched the cold metal. For a brief moment, she thought she might faint, that she might not have the strength to turn the knob. But the moment she touched it, something else happened. A voice, deep and guttural, filled the air. It came from nowhere, and yet it felt like it was all around her. "You cannot leave, Emily." The voice was almost a whisper, but it echoed in her skull, rattling her nerves, scraping against her mind. "This is your place now, forever." Emily gasped, stumbling back from the door. She turned, looking around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the heavy, suffocating air and the pounding of her heart. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with an unseen force, wrapping itself around her, drawing her closer to the inevitable. She tried to scream, but the sound got caught in her throat, like something was choking her from the inside out. She fell to her knees, the key clutched in her hand. What was it? What did it mean? Was it her salvation? Or was it the thing that had cursed her, that had trapped her in this nightmare? Her mind reeled, but she knew one thing with an unnerving certainty: she was not alone. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something just out of sight. It was behind her, close enough that she could almost feel its breath on the back of her neck. She turned, eyes wide, but nothing was there. Only the cold, creeping darkness. The house had become a living, breathing entity, its walls closing in around her, its floors shifting beneath her feet. She was trapped. There was no way out. Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The sound was soft at first, distant, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right behind her. She froze, terror freezing her in place. The figure, the thing that had once been her husband, was standing just behind her, its presence an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her chest. She couldn't bring herself to turn around. No, no, no. She whispered, her voice shaking. This can't be real. This can't be happening. The figure didn't respond. Instead, she felt a hand, a cold, lifeless hand, fall onto her shoulder. The touch was light, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her body. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, as her body went rigid with terror. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," the voice rasped. "You should have stayed away. But now you are one of us. One of the guests. Forever." A cold laugh followed, a sound so hollow, so soulless, that it made Emily's skin crawl. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows around her twisting, distorting, as if they were alive, reaching toward her, pulling her into their embrace. She felt her legs go weak, her body trembling uncontrollably, but she couldn't move. The figure leaned down, its breath cold against her ear. "You're not leaving. Not until the party is over." Emily shuddered, her mind spinning with fear. The thought of staying here, of being trapped with this thing, forever, it was too much to bear. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she closed her eyes, trying to block out the reality around her. She didn't want to accept it. She didn't want to believe it. But the truth was undeniable. She had already entered the nightmare. And there was no way out. But then, something inside her stirred. A flicker of defiance, no matter how small, sparked in her chest. No, she wouldn't go down without a fight. She wouldn't let whatever this was, whatever it had become, win. Emily's hand tightened around the key, the metal burning against her skin. She stood, her legs shaking, her body screaming in protest, but she forced herself to her feet. The darkness was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of the thing behind her, but she had to do something. Anything. She had to fight back. She turned, facing the figure, her eyes wild with terror, but also with a newfound sense of resolve. The figure stood there, still smiling that grotesque, sickening grin, its eyes glowing yellow, but there was something different now. Something in its posture, in the way it looked at her, told her that it was just as afraid of her as she was of it. "You think you can stop this?" the figure asked, its voice dripping with malice. "You think you can fight the inevitable? You're already part of it." But Emily didn't listen. She raised the key high in the air, her fingers trembling but her grip steady. She didn't know if it would work, didn't know if it had the power to destroy whatever dark force had taken over this house, but she had to try. She couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear. Not anymore. With a force she didn't know she had, she thrust the key forward, toward the figure. A sharp, crackling sound filled the air, followed by a deep, resonating thud. The room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as if in pain. The figure let out a guttural screech, one that rattled her bones and made her ears ring, but Emily didn't flinch. The key was glowing now, burning hot with an otherworldly light. The figure was writhing, its form shifting and distorting as if it were being torn apart by some unseen force. Emily stepped back, her heart racing, her body tense as she watched the figure unravel, piece by piece. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a moment, Emily thought the entire house might collapse. The music stopped. The air grew still. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness lifted. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her chest, the suffocating presence that had haunted her every step, it was gone. The room was silent. Still. Empty. And Emily was alone. But the house was no longer the same. The once festive, decorated rooms were now cold, abandoned, and decayed. The walls, once bright with holiday cheer, were now cracked, their paint peeling and rotting. Emily took a deep, trembling breath. She didn't know how much time had passed, but she knew one thing: she had survived. For now. She turned, walking slowly out of the room, the key still clutched tightly in her hand, the weight of it still heavy. She didn't look back.